good day. Welcome. We are back on Sense Space with my good friend Daniel Gunner, OG Rose. Welcome, sir.
Good to be here, Jacob. Thank you for the opportunity. I always enjoy and love speaking with you. So thank you, sir.
Pleasure to have you. And I've called upon your aid in exploring some really deep terrain today. You were the first person who introduced me to the notion of philosophy as self-defense. And this was a really vitalizing, exciting notion. I actually could it really brought philosophy more into my body as like a dynamic force in the world and not as a kind of abstract pontification, occurring amongst the elders of Athens, but rather like here's something really vital between me and the world and between me and the forces of the world. And I thought today that we could develop that a little bit more and develop a kind of shared understanding of that. And in addition, as I was speaking to beforehand, I've been in an ongoing inquiry into spiritual warfare. And as part of the Wrestling with Christianity project that you've been absolutely essential to fostering, this question of spiritual warfare comes through. And it's a big transition from secular mindset to take that on and to start to live it. So, yeah, please, wherever you feel is most intuitive to begin, and we can go from there.
Well, thank you, Jacob. I always enjoy the chance to speak with you, and the Wrestling with Christianity series has been wonderful. So I again, that's just been great. And there's a long history of an understanding that education has something to do with stopping tyranny. You can go to Jefferson, the founding fathers. You can go to Socrates talking about the sophists and the sort of concern about people using words to control. And so there's this notion, I think, that many people have that there's something about education that has something to do with keeping us free, keeping us from being manipulated, keeping us from being controlled. The problem is that without philosophy, you may not have control over the terms of that conflict and that self-defense. And you may actually think you are defending your freedom, all as you play into the hand of some zeitgeist that you have fallen into. And this is why ultimately true education as self-defense actually has to be philosophy as self-defense, because otherwise you don't have control over the terms of the conflict. You start assuming things and not knowing you're assuming things. You start accepting paradigms of what constitutes truth without knowing you've accepted things of truth. And now you're playing into a certain technocratic order. You're playing into a certain fundamentalism. You're playing into a certain ideology, so on and so forth. When I go back, a lot of my interest in philosophy of self-defense comes from David Hume and a lot of the counter-enlightenment thinkers, your Hartmans and different people like that. And what's very interesting, you're kind of taught that David Hume is a bit of a trickster, really, that he comes along and says, hey, there's no such thing as causation. You're like, okay, Hume. He's like, yeah, you can never get from ought from is. You're like, okay, Hume. And it all sounds like he's just kind of playing around. But actually, when you read his essays and you go through his kind of whole canon, what you see is what the man is trying to do is a project of critiquing rationality, which ultimately he's going to talk about philosophy, and he's critiquing abstraction in service of common life and lived experience. Because what he has witnessed as a historian is how people have certain projects of what constitutes the best society, what constitutes what's best for humanity, and they use that to justify controlling people or forcing people to give up their ways of life or to leave their small towns in service of a certain kingdom. And, if someone comes up to you, Jacob, and they say, hey, I need you to join this company and work for them for a bunch of years, or else you hate America or you're not in support of freedom. How do you reply? Well, you're going to have what? You're going to probably have arguments or reasons why that's not true, right? You're going to have to give your reasons why you don't think that premise follows. Okay. So basically what David Hume has seen is where, say, the Pope or the king comes into a small town and says, hey, in the name of Jesus, you all need to serve the king in the military and join this military operation. And if you say don't have the training to go to the Bible and kind of interpret it in a manner that would say, well, no, that's not actually possible that Jesus would have me join an army and on the sake of the king, or not in that way, well, then you have no way to stand against someone who comes in and makes that certain assertion, right? And suddenly you've left your small town, gone off and fought in a war in the name of Jesus on behalf of the king, end up killed, and then it's not even consistent with the Christian doctrine. But there's no way for you to even know that or to be aware of that manipulation unless you yourself have, say, theological training, which classically theological training and philosophical training were really tied together. They were really about the ability to think through things. If someone comes up to you and they say, hey, the only truth is the scientific empirical truth, and here are all the studies over here that say so, and you don't have the philosophical training to critique a reductionist metaphysics, which a lot of people on the liminal web are these days critiquing, but let's go back and say you didn't have that ability, what would you do? It looks true. I mean, it seems pretty reasonable that the only truth is science. I mean, they've got studies. It seems pretty legit to think that way. And so you begin to conform your life around the metaphysics that science is the only way to know truth, and all truth can be fit into a scientific universe or the scientific method or different things. And you start leaving your church, you start leaving your friendships, you start leaving or deciding which friendships to hold and which ones not to hold based on that worldview. And slowly and gradually, your entire life shifts around what this person has told you, that you didn't have any self-defense to stop yourself from absorbing and then changing your life according to. And so what David Hume and all the counter-enlightenment people are warning is that the you cannot escape philosophy. It's basically inevitable. The question is only if you're going to absorb it from someone else or have the ability to use philosophy in service of your common life, not to replace your common life, to participate in your common life. And by common life, what they mean is the life you are living, the life you have chosen. You live on a farm, that's your common life. They're not and that doesn't necessarily mean everyone has to go live on a farm or something like that. It means what they're all telling you is that you're living a life, and one day someone's going to come along and tell you ideas that are going to cost you your life unless you can defend yourself. That's what they're all saying. They're all saying it's only a matter of time. Rather it be the king, rather it be the pope, rather it be the scientist, rather it be the conspiracy theorist, rather it be with the moral mission saying we've got to fight this oppression and you've got to give up your way of life because it's contributing to oppression. Someone is going to come along and tell you that you must change your life, kind of like that Wilke poem, but it's basically a kind of demonic form of it. They're going to come on and say you must change your life, and without the ability to work through philosophy, you will, and you'll find that you lose your life and you have nothing to show for it. So those would be some of the opening statements of why philosophy as self-defense is so important, but why also I would emphasize philosophy, not just education, because the problem is if you just emphasize education, then you could assume that just because you know a lot of facts means you're able to defend yourself against this kind of manipulation. No, because those facts could all be given by the zeitgeist, and you're not able to examine them in accordance with those zeitgeists. So yes, the information may help you defend yourself, but it may also be the means of your manipulation. This is the problem. The education that is supposed to make you able to defend your individuality and your freedom could actually be the very thing taking it away from you if you are not able to critique the metaphysics underlying that education to make sure that's the metaphysics you want to live by, right? So that's why we have to make a distinction between education as liberation and philosophy as kind of self-defense. Education can be, but only to the degree that it also brings with it the various skills of philosophy as self-defense. But we've kind of secretly just kind of assumed that. We've just basically assumed that more schooling will entail that self-defense. And it doesn't necessarily. It depends on the details of that education. But let me give it back to you.
Yeah, that was wonderful and so distilled. Like it feels more distilled than the first few times that I've explored this with you. So I really appreciate that. I want to take us to Hogwarts first, and to Hogwarts, The Order of the Phoenix.
Hmm.
The book, The Order of the Phoenix, not The Order of the Phoenix. And one of the characteristics of Hogwarts is that it's always a little bit dangerous to the power of the Ministry of Magic. This is why the Ministry doesn't really like Dumbledore. He's a little bit outside of their control. And the school is, it has a monastic quality. It's kind of separate from their control. And a key piece of what turns out to give the substance to that is the defense against the dark arts training that is essential to the curriculum at Hogwarts. When the Ministry of Magic seeks to take over Hogwarts and suppress the power of Hogwarts and basically amalgamate it into the Ministry of Magic, which is also denying the problem of evil and Voldemort, the first thing they do is completely undermine defense against the dark arts and replace it with a kind of pseudo defense, which is actually receiving educational curricula from the ministry. So you get these books, and there's a really good scene where Hermione's like, well, you're not teaching us to defend ourselves. And this awful woman Umbridge is like, oh, you've got nothing to, what do you need to defend yourself against? There's nothing to fear. um and so I see a parallel. This is a really beautiful parallel, and I think J.K. Rowling had some insight when she wrote that
Hmm.
that education today does not contain defense against the dark arts. It doesn't really contain philosophy of self-defense, and a lot of it is operating under the confusion that education is self-defense. And so we need only learn the correct version of history or set of facts or set of ideas, and then we will be primed against this other set of ideas, which is the bad set. And as it turns out, that's quite different from the underlying capacity to sense make ideas and to pass things out by yourself, independent of the authority, independent of the narrative, no matter how self-evident or true the narrative may seem to be as you receive it. And so as you were speaking, I was feeling into, like, you've rooted this in Hume and the context of, the early modern world. I want to pull it through now a little bit into the contemporary world and consider some of the different ways in which this is super relevant for people. Because it's not apparent, like self-defense, that means somebody's going to attack me. Philosophy is self-defense. Okay, what does that actually look like? Um, a couple of things. The first, as you describe, is this possibility of manipulation. And we're actually in the age of manipulation now. The tools of manipulation have never been greater. The tools for deception are about to explode in ways that absolutely shatter our sense of what's real and not real. So this is not only it's not only something we can say is important now and retrospectively, but it seems to be kind of an increase. There's like a crescendo of importance to what you're putting forward. And in that context, people face real life decisions. The experience of the last few years, particularly the COVID years, was the kind of prima instantiation of this, because there were a huge collection of claims that were foisted, which have slowly shown several of them to be false, but were foisted as true and became the basis on which people's um, pretty much core existential health decisions were being made, and also the possibility of their freedom, the possibility of their livelihood, were all underpinned by whether they received these claims. And that ultimately came down to an institutional authority. The people who had the most education, for the most part, were the least critical of those viewpoints. The people who occupied the most elite educational institutions and elite sense-making media institutions were all in the deepest conformity and trust of that authority narrative. And the people who had very little education turned out, in many respects, to be more critical. And over time, as we've seen, there's myriad individual claims that I'm not going to go into now because it's not what this podcast is about, have proven actually to be false. And the cost of that can be quite significant for an individual. So that's where we are right now. And I want to see, like, how do we bring this into practice? Perhaps you have more to say actually on the contemporaneousness and future kind of horizon of this threat, but I would love for us also to consider a little bit about what does it mean in practice.
We all always already contain everything inside that we need to destroy ourselves. All we need is something to come along and poke us wrong, and then we turn out to be our own worst enemy. And what we see on the internet, the news, COVID, election fraud, all of these different claims and different things, is basically what happens is you find out, because what they do is, well, you haven't done the studies, you don't know. And there are all these different things that are used that then send you on your own sort of crazy land in your own head. And then because you don't know how to channel that or how to respond to the things that have been thrown at you, you end up seeking a relief from that existential uncertainty. And that almost always looks like the authority. That almost always looks like the collective, because it is so nerve-wracking to deal with those tensions of what if I die, or what if the election, another example with the election being stolen under Trump, how do you know? Are you going to let democracy fall? There's this big fervor with conservatives that if you don't do something, America's over. There's this tension of what you see in all of these. And it can look like actually in Christianity, the nervousness of people will go to hell if you don't tell them about Jesus. There's a certain nervousness that is used that says if you do not act now, something bad will happen. And if that has a formal structure to it, I call it death is the event horizon of reason, which is the idea that once death is introduced, there's no possibility of reasoning, because basically everything must be done to stop that death. It's a self-justifying logic, right? Let's take global warming. If global warming is going to kill us all, then it doesn't matter what we have to do. We have to stop it, right? So it's like an event horizon is the edge of a black hole. There's no way to get past it. You can't think anymore. So here's the key. Be very, very, very careful before you accept any sort of premise that is an apocalyptic thinking, that has a kind of death structure to it, because thinking's over at that point. Now, I'm not saying there are never points where that's not true. I'm not saying there are never instances of apocalyptic thinking, but your bar of justification, the amount of evidence that would be required for you to accept apocalyptic reasoning into your schema must be incredibly high. That would be an example of just one sort of mental model of what it would look like to engage in philosophy of self-defense. The awareness of, okay, this argument entails apocalyptic thinking, therefore the evidence for it needs to be extraordinary. Does it match that or not? Now, what exactly constitutes the quantitative threshold of extraordinary gets into papers like The Conflict of Mind, but I'm going to shelve that for now because I think you can give those answers, but let me shelve it. The point I'm trying to get at is the following. The number one tool that everyone online uses right now is apocalyptic thinking. We're all going to die if you don't do X, Y, or Z. That's why it creates so much existential anxiety and toil within you. And if you don't have the ability to recognize the logical invincibility of that formal structure of an argument, then you're going to find yourself every day of every week constantly oscillating between this kind of apocalyptic reasoning. Rather it be America's going to end if Biden wins again, America's going to end if you don't take the vaccine, America's going to end because of global warming, Russia's going to destroy Ukraine. What do you see here? It's the Paul Virilio media environment of the perpetual crisis that Paul Virilio talks about. If you don't know that the structure itself is invalid, that you literally can't even think the structure, because the structure is unthinkable, because by definition is self-justifying, then you're going to waste all your mental energy on something that's going to mentally tire you out. Here's the key. Authorities tend to win when you're tired. when you're just freaking tired of thinking. You don't want to think about anything anymore. Okay, what does the state say then? What do the corporations say then? What do the scientists say? They're trying to get you exhausted. Once you're exhausted, it's over. You're going to stop. You're either going to become a fundamentalist, you're going to close off, you're going to be an isolationist, you're going to stop thinking, you're going to avoid diversity, you're going to avoid pluralism, you're going to look for a conspiracy to connect everything together so you can make sense of it. Once you are exhausted, all human beings, when they are exhausted, begin cheating, per se. They start looking for shortcuts. That's exactly what the corporations want you to do. Because once you take a shortcut, you're invalidated. You no longer have agency. You no longer have say because you have given up thinking, and you have to preserve your own agency to have any capacity of having a unique navigation in this media landscape, in this corporate landscape, and you're not going to be able to carve a unique path. But so then another way to look at it, this is philosophy as self-defense is philosophy as defending your energy. It is philosophy as defending your own inner motivation and ability to keep going, which if you lose, you will be tired and then let your thinking be done by the system. So philosophy is self-defense. So another way to kind of ground it is everyone is today what? Exhausted. Everyone today feels like life, they're depressed, meaning crisis. All of these are a kind of energy crisis, right? There's a feeling of I can't get up in the morning. I can't bring myself to do anything. I can't finish anything. What's the point? All of this is a kind of motivation crisis, a kind of tiredness you hear in people's voices. That is what philosophy exists to keep you from falling into. That's one of its key functions. Aristotle's always describing the movement, the first movement, the last movement, the motivation, the libido. We can even talk Lacan and different things. So another thing is if there's an energy crisis today, if there's an exhaustion crisis today, that has a lot to do as well with philosophy because you're defending your mind from getting lost down rabbit holes or taken in directions that you will inevitably get frustrated and lost in. And and there are many of them, not just this death as the event horizon one, but this is an example. But a common quality of all of them is the exhaustion of the individual. Because once the individual is exhausted, they're going to stop trying. And once they stop trying, they cannot be free. So philosophy is also fighting against exhaustion.
Yeah, that's really well put. And I think it points to the way in which this is not only kind of about defending yourself from ideas in the noosphere and the news and the media. And of course, that's not just in the news and media, it's through everybody in your relational fabric. That's where you encounter it. That's where the conversation ultimately happened, didn't happen, got frozen, turned into the breaking apart of families and relationships. All of that was at some level to do with capacity for dialogue, reasoning, and energetic self-defense. And of course, there are other less kind of tyrannical, but equally important things like work, like relational demands that are imbalanced, all of which can undermine your sovereign capacity to here's my kind of sphere of continually regenerating energy with which I can direct my attention to what my philosophy helps me realize is most important to me. And if I don't have that kind of walled garden of my psyche, then I will be exploited and my attention will literally and we have the most effective tools for this in all human history right now. Just take it. Oh, wait, I wanted to read books. I wanted to read this great work of fiction. Oh, I wanted to work on this philosophy project. Oh, I wanted to exercise. No, I just sat on my bed and scrolled some amazing memes that were, algorithmically targeted to keep me in there. And, the algorithm is also showing me the precise set of people that I have crushes on at this particular time that is going to keep me looking at the app. So another piece that came up for me that I think we could also kind of include with like what philosophy of self-defense offers us a bulwark against. And this is more about relational dynamics, and it actually includes both interpersonal relationships and relationships with authorities. A lot of what people were finding, and has become almost a cliche because uh, it's become so widespread in the cultural conscious now, is this notion of gaslighting, um, of somebody telling you things that aren't true and then changing what's true and kind of switching up reality on you in such a way that you lose track of your capacity to track what's true, and you even begin to doubt yourself in relation to that. A lot of people felt that was going on for them in relation to authorities during the COVID years. They would say one thing for a long time, then they would switch it up to the other thing and kind of deny that they had said anything before. And then it's like the sense of confusion is kind of is put onto you. Um, you also just keep with what the present story is. Totalitarian regimes do this a lot. They rewrite the past, and then it's like, okay, time for the software update. This is what's true now. Um, Toxic relationships bear a similar quality to this, in which people can be, in a family structure or relationship, they can be exhausted, worn down by like a more like dominant or tyrannical person, and the effect of that, if it succeeds, will eventually exhaust their capacity of independent sense making, and they will give over their sense making to the dominant party. And I think that philosophy of self defense in this respect could also be very, very important for a lot of people who don't consider themselves to be engaged in intellectual matters, or really engaged about the news, or engaged in philosophy at all. It's just at the level of what's true. Can I stay with what's true? Can I guard my energy sufficiently to have a space to like think about that by myself? Um, and so I wanted to include that as like a final piece for like mm, why this is so important, what this guards us against, and why this really is something for like every man and woman.
Excellent. No, that's excellent. I will note that there's a lot of emphasis today just on this point on energetics, which I think is very significant for relationships, because people tend to do their worst in relationships when they're what? Exhausted, tired, existentially overwhelmed. So these things all feed into one another. There's a lot of emphasis on post-truth manipulation and all that, and I'm not saying that there's none of that going on, but the key strategy, whether intentional or not, of the society is one of making people exhausted. It's an energetic warfare. Because when people are exhausted, they tend to be what? More manipulatable. When people are exhausted, they tend to be what? Fall into fundamentalism that kind of disconnects them from pluralism in the globalized world, where they can make a difference and can be easily tagged as fascist or something, right? What happens when people lack energy? Then they tend to just scroll on their phones and be irrelevant, and they don't have agency, right? So what you see is the complexity of the world leads to primarily a feeling of exhaustion, which is energetic warfare. Tyranny today has more of a kind of energetic tyranny, is more of what you see. It's not a directly oppressive tyranny. It's also like an Orwell, nor is it a tyranny. We also make a mistake if we overemphasize pleasure as the means of manipulation, because you really don't even see that so much, because pleasure eventually runs out. People eventually find out that a new car doesn't make them happy, and then they start looking around, right? So there's a kind of limitation to how much pleasure can control people, unless you get them exhausted and then they're seeking pleasure just to feel something again. But you must do the exhaustion first, which ties into Ivan, because exhaustion is a form of disablement, which is Ivan Illich. And then when people are disabled, and they are exhausted, which means they're disabled in terms of their energy, then they are more susceptible to be like Joseph K. in the trial, Kafka, where they emergently and organically on their own participate willingly in their own oppression and eventual execution. So the exhaustion part of this is primary, and that's where looking at a Paul Virilio, I think, is extremely important. The acceleration of society to overwhelm people and other thinkers like that. In that context, if you're not aware of what is worth putting your energy, you must choose to put your energy into something that proves to be a renewable energy. You get energy from doing it and it feeds back into you and it's growing. And so there's something about philosophy of self-defense that inherently means making good choices, because if you make good choices, you defend yourself from bad choices and the consequences of those bad choices, right? And if you are aware that there are many things that exist to take your energy so that you're exhausted, you become wiser about what you choose to put your energy into, what you choose to do, right? And so likewise, if you come to realize, like if we take a David Hume, where he says, well, you know, you really can't ever from an abstract category or understanding get to reality. You need to take reality in its own face directly, touch grass, if you will, be practical. And we're entering an age where touch grass means touch sanity, so you better do it. Well, that would mean when you enter into a relationship, you're a lot more careful to bring your preconceived ideas of what you think the relationship should have, what that person thinks you should be, who you think that person is. And you also come to realize that ideas can get in the way of people. Funny enough, philosophy is at its best when it tends to actually be quite skeptical of ideas. But you need an idea to be skeptical of ideas to put ideas in the right order with reality. You can never escape ideas. The question is, can you rightly order them? Here's the problem. The other reason you need philosophy is because your brain tends to naturally be a frenemy. It's naturally in the business of self-deception, egotism, pride, interpreting things in a manner that makes you right over the other person. Your brain is really not in the business of knowing truth primarily. It's in the business of your survival and making you comfortable. Well, that means you have to train your brain to not fall into those tendencies, right? And that means you need philosophy to think about how you think so that it does not get in the way of your personal relationships, the people you encounter, and things like that. So what ended up happening, like today, one of the reasons you could say philosophy of self-defense is so critical is because you've got this double thing going on where people naturally fall into the tricks of their frenemy brain, but then they go, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be educated. So they go off to school, but then that makes education assuming a certain metaphysics, and it makes them paying attention to it. Being informed and being educated is paying attention to a media landscape that exhausts you. So you've got two options: falling into the self-deception of your brain or being exhausted, both of which leads to a use of your thinking and your energy in a manner that's probably not good for your relationships or good for your capacity to understand the other people. So society is kind of caught swinging between those two. Either the people who have not worked are not aware of the need to work on their brain to fall into these frenemy tendencies, which can lead to all sorts of problems, or the people who think they have dealt with their brain by going off and, say, getting a college education, who are actually just falling into the zeitgeist of the day, and so the frenemy brain is still winning there. Or they end up in a form of exhaustion that makes them unable to handle the other, and we just swing back and forth and back and forth. But since the people in college say, well, at least I'm not those country bumpkins falling into their self-deceived brains, and then the country bumpkins say, well, at least I'm not those college idiots who are falling into the narrative of the media, then both sides feel like they're educated over the other, but without philosophy, neither of them are actually educated, because all of them are falling into the manipulation of which benefits the principality and lord of the age, as Paul would call Satan at one point, right? And so what you have is people believing that they're choosing an option to escape the other that doesn't actually change the entire board, that is manipulating everybody into an energetic tyranny that makes them unable to forge their own way. And then, of course, relationships suffer. I mean, when people don't, and energy, you know, I'm emphasizing energy. That's something that Dave at Theory Underground emphasizes very well in his book on time energy. And I think that's a powerful piece of this, where people are not able to deal with these problems or think through these problems, their relationships will suffer. They're also not going to be, they're going to be very prone, and this is what you mentioned, COVID, and happened with Trump and all this. They're best friends. Like, if they've been trained to think that this is the moral truth to do this, and their wife is on the other side, they end up in a divorce. Or if their friends are on the other side, then they never speak to them again. And then the communities start falling apart. All of this stuff that we're describing, unless you're going to be radically isolationist like the Amish, which more and more people are looking at and saying maybe we should do that, is going to actually have real impacts on your relationships and on your friendships. They're going to be greatly damaged. And so then what can happen, honestly, is that people who want to preserve their common life say, well, we need to escape the global world. Well, then we're looking at Dugan, right? Then we're looking at isolationists. Then we're looking at the end of pluralism. It's like, if we can't figure out this philosophy thing, then pluralism, globalized pluralism and diversity is in massive trouble, because basically people are not going to be able to know how to handle all of these pressures in a manner that does not translate into them breaking down or destroying their diverse relationships. I'll give it back to you, but we could also get into, I think Hegel teaches us that logic and metaphysics is about the mediating of the instincts. Chekhov tells us that people who love one another are constantly misunderstanding one another, so you need philosophy to work through misunderstandings in relationships. You also need philosophy to really, really, truly believe that people are different. Like, to really believe that people are different, you really have to have this ability to perpetually work against your own ideas of how the world works or who people are, to see them for themselves. I'm not sure if a deep, deep, deep sense of empathy is possible without philosophy, because it's just too difficult. Without philosophy, what we all naturally seem to do is put our shoes in another person's shoes, not our feet in another person's shoes. And so you need that perpetual working against yourself to make sure you do those things. So those are some things that come to mind.
Yeah, that's really excellently put. I particularly love the way you laid out this dichotomy that characterizes the American culture war in a really significant way. Um, it's a kind of classic move of manipulation by power to make you think that this other group is the ultimate root of evil, and then you feel pretty good now that you've identified the evil one, and you've kind of got yourself being in the other group. And collectively, we're struggling a great deal to develop beyond this stage, and philosophy seems to be part of that, as you say, really significant for how, like, the quality of our relationships will suffer when we have to shut down all of these areas of conversation, because when we confront them, all we get is triggers or possible existential threats to the relationships that we can't hold. And so then what actually becomes friendship is this much more limited social context, and it eludes depth, because the same depth that would have you discuss what's going on in the world is in some sense the depth that would have you discuss what's really going on in your own life. um, and so without philosophy, and we could say there are other things alongside this, um, various forms of spiritual practice and mindfulness would also be really important pieces of this. um, uh, we're not simply talking about philosophy as cultivated reasoning, the capacity to distinguish and think through. I think there's also a somatic wisdom involved in this, and the capacity to actually, like, notice the trigger that comes up in the dialogue and regulate that and kind of settle that sufficiently that you can start to see beyond your own emotion or your own projection. And as you say, um, it's very important that we can actually start to see the other and have an encounter with the other, and not just the other as mediated through ourself. So I feel like maybe this is an interesting juncture or transition point to consider the second half of this conversation. Maybe there's more for um, philosophy as self-defense you want to include. I'm happy to do that. But I think spiritual warfare is another area where this gets interesting, and I can see a really significant segue. Um, because a lot of what gets lost in culture war, tribalistic games is you think that the root enemy, the root thing that you are in opposition to is this group or this set of ideas. And what spiritual warfare seems to afford in some respects is getting to a place where it's not fundamentally just about those other people. It's the energy of it's malevolence in the world that you're ultimately in opposition to. And a lot of the spiritual wisdom says that this kind of is rooted in our own hearts. And that's the first place we come to understand and work with that. And so from that can also be a kind of a source of resilience from getting caught in, well, like, it's ultimately those Republicans or those Anthony Fauci or whoever it is, like that they're the thing. There's a deeper plane at which the problem space can be navigated. There's different dimensions from which you can understand what is this manipulation that actually get you outside of the purely kind of modern material landscape within which we've mostly had the conversation so far, and add these more metaphysical dimensions. And I think that's possibly a next horizon, although it's obviously something from the past as well for us to explore, both in understanding what we're defending against and how we resource to be defended and to cultivate resilience.
Excellent. I like what you were saying on friendship being very limited. I think that's exactly right. I think relationships become very limited. And when they're limited like that, they become shallow. And when they're shallow, they're fragile. And if they're fragile, the likelihood of being able to form groups or communities that could resist power collectively is very, very low. So I think there's also a benefit to power if friendships are fragile like that. And yet what ends up happening is people go, well, actually, because we're friends, we don't talk about the trigger words, right? We don't, like, you start defining a relationship by one where you respect not bringing up those terms. And now you're actually using morality in service of creating the shallowness and fragility of which benefits power. And that would be an example of why you need philosophy of self-defense, because otherwise, if you don't do that, what you begin moralizing as good and bad becomes in service of a paradigm or premise you've never questioned that may benefit the very power that doesn't care much about you. It only cares about itself. And so you have to be aware of that, because we as human beings, we must have an ethic. Whether it's a good ethic or a bad ethic, we must believe some things are good and some things are bad. So if you don't think about what you think is good, and if you don't think what is bad, it's just going to happen. You're just going to naturally absorb an idea of what's good or bad. And you're not even going to know where it comes from. It's just going to be absorbed. And really, a lot of people's ethics just comes from the silent space of what people organically and silently do. Okay, no one ever brings up these deep issues, then I won't. That must be the right thing to do. No one ever says that, but it's what you absorb. And what everyone then absorbs that's reinforced by everyone's just doing what everyone else is doing, then actually unintentionally comes to create a fragility that makes collective action less likely. And so another reason you need philosophy is to be able to think the things that no one says. But if nobody says them, then why would you know to think them? Because you are active in your thinking. So you start thinking about things that you don't even, like, that no one else is thinking about, simply because you get the habit of active thinking. And that would be another reason why philosophy as self-defense is very important, is because without it, you are basically destined to only think the thoughts that everyone else is thinking. And if everyone is not thinking something that you need to think, you're out of luck then, So you have to have your own, unless you want to take the life investment strategy of assuming that everyone is thinking everything that needs to be thought. That I personally would not take that bet, because history does not show that's a good investment of life strategy. But that's basically what you have to do without your own active thinking, is you will simply think what everyone else thinks. So you better hope that everyone is thinking everything that needs to be thought, and that it's not in service of some problem. On what you were saying on philosophy, spiritual warfare, et cetera, so forth, I think it helps when we take philosophy as love of wisdom. That whole phrase is really important. And Schindler talks about this, and our beloved Ken has spoken with him on how it's about this gathering under beauty. Gathering, love of wisdom means you're gathered under wisdom collectively. A lot of the problem with our understanding of what philosophy is comes from a kind of nervousness of wanting it to be more like science, because all the humanities nervously want to be more like science. And so philosophy is like, oh, it's about finding truth. Well, in a way, of course, but not in the same sort of empirical certainty way that the scientific method is supposed to do it. You find truth by being gathered under truth and coordinated and dance under it. And if you get that, you can see why friendship actually basically requires philosophy to not be limited in the ability to go into these things, because otherwise friends can't be gathered in friends cannot be gathered under something that's bigger than themselves. That they mutually participate in, and in so participating know each other better. It's very, I think philosophy as self-defense is also necessary for defending your friendships and defending the possibility of friendship. Because I think it is very difficult to have deep friendship if you don't have the ability to think things that are greater than both of you or all of you, and yet you can all be gathered under them in a dance, but then when you're not together as friends, still be thinking about and participating. So when you come back together, the dance can take on a new color and so on and so forth. Philosophy allows this very interesting doing things in relation that you can work on independently, that then you can work on in relation, and you can then bring your philosophy to your walks in nature, to everything you do, because it's coloring your mind. So it's this way where philosophy allows a middle ground between the individual and the collective that otherwise seems basically impossible, because it has to be enforced by power, because it allows the gathering under something. The other way to look at this is that basically truth always organizes values, as the opening essay of The Conflict of Mind. So, and why this is important is because, you know, what we believe is moral, what we believe is good, what we believe is bad is all relative to what we believe is true. Like if you think X is true, then Y is moral because it participates in that truth, right? So without philosophy, you do not have an ability to determine what you collectively believe is true, to then collectively determine what is going to be moral for you and moral between one another and what is right action to one another. So if you cannot collectively determine that, it's only a matter of time before the friends hurt each other, the friendship is broke, or the morality is given to you by someone outside of you. So the point is that truth and morality are strongly tied together. But it also means that you cannot determine what is moral without first determining what you think is true. What we see in the modern world is a lot of people who want to talk about what's moral without asking what's true, or that's a secondary question. And they also don't have the philosophical ability by which to determine what is true. So all they have is the feeling of what is moral. Well, now we have the mob. Now we have the kind of a project. It's an ethic of what is right that can't gather under anything. So all it can do is destroy and tear everything down. And I think that's basically what you see unleashed in the world today. An ethic of what is right that does not have a truth to gather anyone under. And so what it does, all it has to gather people is the outrage behind the moral action. Oh, the election was stolen. Oh, this is oppression. Oh, this is contributing to X, Y, and Z. There's a moral outrage, but the problem is that means community can only last in so much as there's what? Outrage. So the other issue is, and this is where I think it gets into spiritual warfare. So the character of philosophy is the gathering under truth. That means people are gathered together. And self-defense is then the ability to defend that dance so you can keep the dance going, and to defend that truth so you don't lose this, which finds this middle between collective and individual, friend and individual, and these kind of working and informing one another. If you do not have that, then you're still going to be gathered under something, but it tends to take a form of what? Rage, nationalism, war. And that's a kind of spiritual force, right? There's a kind of evil spiritual force that then comes to have the function of gathering everyone under something, but it tends to be a moral outrage that's disconnected from a truth, or a national identity that is from a place of we're the best and we don't need other people, or it's from sort of project of reestablishing a justice that is no longer connected to a truth. So philosophy, if we think of spirits as something that people are gathered under. Philosophy is an awareness that we're going to be gathered under something, or the only things that can collect us. Well, let's put it this way: with philosophy, you can be gathered under. Without philosophy, all you can do is be collectivist. All you can be is a mob. All you can be is a kind of force. And so what you see today is people trying to find their identity in these kind of collectivist movements or these kind of mass movements, or they just atomize because it's too painful and too difficult. They either join an outrage or they just stay in their apartment and don't even try. And they're too, and then if they do try, they're so exhausted and they don't have the skills to relate to people, they just find themselves in conflict, so then retreat to their apartment, like the horde in Japan, the people who don't leave their apartments or different things. So I would definitely say that the character of philosophy and spiritual warfare all go together when we think about philosophy as gathering under and the idea that if we're not aware of the ability to think truth so that we're gathered under something of our own making that's more like a dance, we're going to end up collected under something that is more destructive or that is tearing through different things. And so we have to be aware of that and be intentional, because otherwise the only way we'll find community is in something that's more destructive in that sense.
Yeah, I really like that. It rhymes a lot with the sense that there's a significant effort to demolish and do away with hierarchy of all forms in the world today. And there is a philosophical recognition I've gleaned that mostly through Peterson and others, that hierarchy is not so much something that we created and it wasn't there before. It's more like you come into reality and you navigate through hierarchy. This hierarchy of attention is fundamental to human sense making. We choose to focus on one person walking down the street instead of another. We determine some aspect is more beautiful than another. We determine a place is more beautiful than another. We sense that one person is more worthwhile to follow than another. Someone is a more valuable friend than another. So hierarchy is always there. The question is not hierarchy or no hierarchy. The question is, what kind of hierarchy, and what's the process through which we determine what kind of hierarchy. And philosophy seems to offer a way in which virtues can become kind of the highest organizing principles of our hierarchy. And if we're not in the process of how to elevate the most true and the most beautiful, the most wise hierarchical forces, then we will operate from the inherited hierarchical forces. For example, what culture tells you is worthwhile. And the problem with that, and it's a thread that runs through all of this conversation, is that culture is deeply, deeply historical. In many respects, the values that we inherit are recent, and they are the consequence of particular historical and scientific developments. Which is not to say there's not a reason, there's not sort of an intrinsic value in saying if something's been around for a long time, it's been tried and tested. There's something to that. But there's also a sense in which we're born into a certain matrix of reality, and that might not be all that is. It might not even be fundamentally true. And in the West today, many people are popping out of a secular and atheistic worldview that they've been born into. So this is a prime example of culture told you this is all there is. And at a certain point, you had an experience or you reached a place of crisis in which you had to actually break out of that into finding more of what's available. So spiritual warfare has the language of warfare in it. the Christian context is perhaps obviously the one that from which we're receiving this most significantly. The language in there is a mixture, I would say. I'm not a biblical scholar, of defensive and offensive language. There's a sense of creating a robustness against forces of evil, in this case, satanic or the devil. People have a lot of qualms about that. And it's very much a contested terrain right now in the conversation between the secular worldview and a reintegration of a theological Christian worldview. Does evil exist as an entity, as a force, not just as a consequence of socioeconomic conditions or trauma or something like that? So I haven't necessarily gone through this in a rational and structured way, but I've definitely been moving into a process of really feeling that there is a reality to this, that there is a kind of force in the world which seeks to undermine my flourishing and my moving more towards light, truth, and beauty. And the way that I have come to sense that is that at several junctures when I'm coming closer to the truth and the light and I'm coming more into my spiritual force, um, I experience these kinds of energetic assaults coming at me. Satan is described in the Christian tradition as the deceiver, and also being the one who is like most close to the light but not light. In a way, there's this kind of like deceptive quality of appearing to be the thing but not being the thing. And I'm interested how people who are listening are going to relate to that and what experiences they've had of this, whether they do have a sense of, wow, that actually did feel like something's trying to really undermine my purpose. This wasn't just like a neutral experience. This wasn't just like an offhand comment, a disregard. This was like something or somebody came into my field in such a way that really seemed to um, attempt to make me weaker and attempt to undermine me and deter me from pursuit of what I feel is most true, beautiful, and meaningful. So that's how I would describe what we are up against. I think there's a way in which you can also map this onto the kind of egregores or large social pathologies, which ultimately the lessons of the 20th century do point to produce the most extensive and terrible evil. Uh, it's not necessarily just out of individual corruption. It's often the corruption within the collective and the giving over of our sense making and morality and choice making to the collective, in which we say, I was just following orders. I was just going along with the crowd when I chose to stone that woman or execute that person or bully that other child in the school playground. So there's something about spiritual warfare which is girding us against those things. And I want to just like we're just kind of opening the door of what this is. We can get a little bit more into like how it might be conducted and so on and how it relates, but I just want to open it down.
Excellent. A few things. Another way to look at it is that a lot of the great battle is the battle between gathering under, which would be dance, and collectivist against, which would be legion. Because there's always this interesting notion that the demons have this kind of legion character to them. But so it's this multiplicity acting as a chaotic oneness, but that's distinct from the dance of the Trinity. But you see, this right here gets us into the problem of evil because those seem mighty similar, and yet they're not. So how do you tell the difference between dance and legion, Trinity and legion, right? Because the ability to say, tell this distinction seems to ride on it. There's also a big difference. What we see in the world today is people treating values as truths versus understanding that truth organizes values. The problem is that if values are true, there's a kind of legion to everyone operating. There's a kind of uniformity to everyone treating their values as truth, but this uniformity leads to chaos and a lack of relation. There's a uniformity in the destruction of relations, as opposed to in a dance, there's a uniformity of the relationship. But this is where everything is so tricky. And again, why it does seem something like philosophy is required, because the difference between life and death is very small. It's very minimum. It's a very thin line where, you were mentioning Satan, Satan, angel, light bearer, morning star. These are all strangely holy sounding terms. And yet they are devoid of the right ordering and substance that would make them holy. A lot of life is a matter, if we go to an Augustine tradition, which people like Aquinas and everyone kind of shares, is that evil is a disordered good. Evil does not have substance. It is a lack of good. Well, that means everything that is evil is a disordered good. Nothing evil about sex, but there's something wrong with lust because it's a misordered relation to sex. Nothing wrong with food, but there's something wrong with gluttony because it's a misordered relation to food. Evil is relational. It's a misordered relation, but it is a relation, but it is not a substance. That's what they want to kind of argue. It's also very interesting in the Bible. I'm not saying the word evil is never used, but you'll actually notice the word evil is not as prevalent as things like sin or other terms. Evil also, it's hard to use that term because evil is a judgmental state. Like you're saying that's evil, as in it's a state, as in it is evil. But the Christian or Christian theology would be very hesitant to use any is language for evil, because that would give it substance. So this is part of the thing that leads to confusion. People look on the world today and they're saying, well, there's no evil. And the Christian would say, well, of course there isn't, because it's a misordered good. There is no isness of evil. So they're like, look at this murderer. Well, he had a bad socioeconomic condition. It's like, well, yeah, he is evil. He did evil per se. And it's the difference between judgment and assessment that we'll talk about in OG Rose. Like judgment is when I say you are a liar. Assessment is when I say you lied. The first is defining your essence according to the lie. You are a liar, where the second is simply assessing an action that occurred, right? So the interesting thing is evil. Now, of course, you can say you are a liar to mean you lied. I'm not trying to be a sentence structure Nazi or something like that. But the point is that evil is not an isness. Evil is not a thing. Even Lucifer, even Satan is a disordered good because he's the highest angel, right? So the issue is that because today people don't, in my opinion, know what evil is, then they look out in the world, don't see evil as isness, think that disproves the existence of evil, stop putting up their defenses against evil, and now they're entirely vulnerable. Because they're not thinking about evil as a disordered good that they are always susceptible to, and being a being that therefore they need to be on guard of to make sure they're always rightly ordered. So this is why thinking of evil as an isness as opposed to a disordered good can contribute to having your defenses down. Because you yourself, here's the other trick. When you look at yourself, you're never going to see evil because evil isn't a thing. So you will then, if you're looking for evil to judge yourself as good or bad, when you don't see it, you're prone to what? Overconfidence, complacency, laziness, not doing what you need to do to stay rightly ordered. So it's very important to understand that spiritual warfare, in a way, is spiritual ordering, keeping things in the right order, keeping things in the dance versus the legion, keeping things gathered under the truth as opposed to have values become truth, and then engaging in and then if evil is this deceptive thing, deception is very interesting. Deception is not a punch to the face. What is deception primarily? It is appearance. It is language. It is words. Well, what is philosophy in the business of? You could say philosophy is the opposite of deception. So if your main enemies to making yourself evil are deception-based, which I think they basically are, well, then the main way to stop evil is to be what? Non-deceivable. Well, what do you need to do to be non-deceivable? You need to be able to think truth And what does it mean to think truth? It means to gather under truth, and that's philosophy. The love of wisdom, the gathering under the wisdom. To be gathered under wisdom is the opposite from being deceivable, right? And so if deception is this evil, then the ability to be gathered under wisdom is to avoid the disordering that evil causes. Because yes, this is what happens. People look back on history and they say, well, the only reason they killed all those people is because they were protecting themselves. Oh, the only reason they did that terrible thing is because of X, Y, and Z. They find good motivations and therefore say that it wasn't evil, right? St. Augustine made very clear that there is no such thing as an evil motivation. If you do X, it's because you think it is good. Otherwise, you would not be doing it. If you think that, if you want to kill someone, you think it would be good if they were dead, right? Now, that doesn't mean it is good, but the point is that there's no such thing as an evil motivation. The reason this is important is because what we're doing is we're looking around the world, or we're looking for history to prove the existence of evil by the existence of evil motivation. We don't see it. Therefore, we think evil doesn't exist. Therefore, we ourselves go, well, I don't have any evil motivations for what I'm doing. I'm just trying to save America from the election being stolen. I don't have any evil motivations. I'm just trying to stop these fascists from defending from hurting these minorities. So then, by not having the philosophy to realize there's no such thing as a bad motivation, that then translates to looking at yourself perhaps as having only good motivations. Therefore, you're a good person, and therefore you participate in the Legion that is destroying everything. And it never occurs to you that this could be participating in the mistakes of history because your motivations are good. Well, yes, all evil has good motivation because evil is a misordered good. The good motivation is what makes possible the misordered good. So what you see all in this is a much more complicated relationship between good and evil that's in a kind of way that they get out of order, that the only way to keep in order is with philosophy, that if you miss that, you yourself could be participating in some of the great horrors or things that destroy relationships, and you will only experience it yourself as doing the right thing. And I would also say, lastly, if evil is a misordered good, and good has a lot to do with light and energy, then if the world is undergoing a kind of energetic crisis, this would suggest you're under the Lord of the Age or a kind of evil age. Because the collapse of energy, if energy is life, and there's something about that is life, and a disordered life would be non-life, the loss of energy, then the very fact you could also look at spiritual warfare as the honoring and preserving of energy in the conditions of inspiration, because inspiration creates energy. And that means anything that destroys beauty, anything that destroys truth and goodness, all of the three infinites, truth, beauty, and goodness, are inspirational. So they create energy. They create the desire to create. So anything that removes truth, goodness, and beauty removes inspiration. Anything that removes inspiration in this sense is evil because it removes energy. And if it removes energy, it removes creation and creating, because for God, creation is always creating because he's an eternal being. So any removal of creating is evil because the rightly ordered creation is always creating, and it is always motivated by the inspiration of itself that is inherent in itself by God's ordering, so that it can be its own self-turning wheel in that sense. So I think it also helps when we think of evil in terms of this removal of inspiration, this removal of energy, this removal of life, not merely a moral judgment, because the moral judgment is too much on the side of an isness that then confuses us to look for evil as substance, which doesn't exist, which then when we don't see, we become overconfident in our own goodness, which then makes us more susceptible to fall into this disordering.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I see. I see in the Christian tradition that there may be a way in which the sense of evil not as a there-ness in the world, but as an extra dimensional force that is this, an ever-present challenge, is something that's supposed to kind of gird you with humility, and is supposed to kind of keep you disciplined to a degree, devoted, you could also say, to those things which kind of water the garden and don't give way to that entropy. And of course, we know like once your garden, once your practices, once the things that give right order and harmony to your life start to crumble, then it's not long before your mind itself starts to give way to, your mind suffers a kind of entropy, and now the frequency of your thinking has been reduced. Your creative contribution has been reduced. You have become closer to what the Matrix mythology kind of positions you as. You've just become another cog. You've become a manipulable piece. You have lost the divine spark, which always makes you a threat to complicated systems of control which seek to reduce reality to something less than containing divine sparks. And what I really like about this kind of spiritual warfare as right ordering, right balancing, right harmonizing, right resonating of things is the multifaceted quality of it. It does seem that prayer is a very significant piece of the practice of spiritual warfare in the Christian tradition. There may be others that we could explore, and that the other is relationship to Christ. And that's very interesting because, as we've spoken to, you use the language of kind of gathering under wisdom, gathering under truth, gathering under beauty. For me, I often think of it more as, having relationship to truth, having relationship to wisdom. But it's ultimately the robustness and the richness, the fibrosity of those relationships, which gives them resilience, so that when you encounter ugliness or your conditions calls you to be discombobulated, that love of wisdom is sufficient that you return to it, just as the love of the relationships in your life, they're sufficiently cultivated, will weather the storm. And so the relationship to Christ as spiritual avatar, let's say, maps similarly to this. It's like, what's the strength of your relationship to the most good avatar that you can hold, is what gives you the resilience to face the attack. And yeah, the other thing I like about it is the multidimensionality. It's not saying it's just, just go to confession or, some more traditional notion. It's about philosophy. It's about cultivation of beauty in your environment. If indeed inspiration is threatening to evil, then having an environment that inspires you is a significant piece of that. I was thinking recently about music as something which could be considered an act of spiritual warfare. For me, I think when I'm making music and when I'm listening to the music that I've made, it functions as a kind of spiritual binding. However, that's not always the case with music, because you can create things that are not filled with that, spirit, that your highest spirit is not injected into those artifacts. You could just surround yourself with low frequency artifacts. And in this way, then you would actually be, the music is having a negative effect on your net capacity for spiritual warfare. And then if you think about that at a big picture level, well, if all of rap music commercially starts to move into this place where it's like the most debased values, and it's not calling to anything deep or high, which I would argue a lot of rap music, with exception to a few greats, has moved in that direction. There's something you could say satanic about that. I still feel like an edge to that word. I'm not totally comfortable with it, but it's a collective force in the culture which is undermining the resilience of our relationality to the good. And therefore, if you can produce art, if you can produce dialogue, if you can write books, if you can create spaces that are in contra to that, cultivating beauty, then your act of creativity is perhaps one of your most potent forms of spiritual warfare.
Completely. Berjaya put an emphasis on Christians as participating in the creative act over salvation. And creation is salvation. You can get salvation and creation, but the risk is if you emphasize salvation, you may not also get the creation and lose both in the sort of C.S. Lewis sense, where if you, C.S. Lewis once said that if you put first things first, you get second things also, but if you put second things first, you lose both. And I do worry there's a bit of that going on, and Berjaya was quite concerned. I think also it's another topic. There was a form of Christianity that emphasized Christology that was substitutional versus participatory. And that also led to a lot of trouble because when you start saying that Jesus is a substitute for our sins, or he's a substitute for the evil of the world, kind of the economical atonement sort of stuff. I'm getting in the weeds of theology, but if you take my word for it, this was very problematic versus no, Jesus is whom we participate in with the Holy Spirit and try to be like. And that sin is avoided by being like Jesus, not by simply letting Jesus, like we can do nothing to get out of sin because we're sinful, but Jesus is going to be substituted for us. So that has gotten into losing sight of the creative act. The creation is inspirational. It is, beauty is a kind of dojo based on what what we're saying, like to be surrounded by beauty trains you in spiritual warfare, because the more inspired you are, the more you tend to fight better. And you see the real horror too is that if you overemphasize a Christianity of substitutive atonement, well, then there's really no incentive to create the conditions of beauty and, spiritual warfare. There's nothing we can do about it anyway, because we're totally fallen. So in that kind of doctrine of atonement, you get a Christianity that does not emphasize the conditions of inspiration and being and excelling in spiritual warfare. It becomes very otherworldly. And really, it's very important to not have a religion, in my opinion, that's substitutive at all. If you have any religion that's substitutive, meaning you substitute this world for the next, or this, your concerns with some distant God, as opposed to a participatory religion, well, that in of itself, a participatory religion would contribute to things like spiritual warfare, would contribute to things like inspiration, would contribute to creating a world that's a dojo in terms of beauty, whereas substitutive can remove those motivations. And the problem is the substitutive theologies play into the hands of power in the system, because you're not training, you're not being prepared against the system. You then fall into the power structure. So I think it's so this is an example where theology has practical consequences. If you have the wrong theology, that's more substitutive than participatory, if you grant my language, well, that's going to directly impact how you live your life and directly impact if you're more susceptible to the system or not. And so it's really important to, I think these things, but then of course to think these things, you would need what? Philosophy. I think also with the word gathering, it's important, like, as you were saying, relational gathering, it's almost like a Mayday pole, although it's hard to use that symbol after the Midsummer movie now, but the Mayflower pole, like it's a vertical relation. Like you're gathered, to be gathered under something is to share in a vertical relation with everyone who's gathered under that same thing. If you're under the sun, in a way you relate to everyone else who's under the sun through a vertical relation. Now, the risk of a vertical relation is that it's meaningless, because I guess when I'm under the sun, I'm relating to the people 50 miles down the road. Likewise, if we're all under Jesus as Christians or something, that could be meaningless because I don't know you. But the vertical, let's put it this way, when you have a vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension, well, then for all of the problems that happen in the horizontal, we can turn to the vertical to make up for it. Then I also, in having a vertical relation with a stranger I've never met before, we have something in common to me. This is where religion has played a really powerful role in making community possible, because you have relations with people you've never met just by sharing in this religion. And you have a common text that you can talk about and debate over and discuss. even though you're just meeting them, even though they're from an entire different racial background and so on and so forth. The gathering structure and the vertical relationships allows you to have some sort of connection with strangers, which is pretty powerful. But it's also really dangerous if that's, say, the nation state or the scientific paradigm, because that's how you get the mob. And that's why so much rests upon the quality of that vertical relation. Is it a living God? Is it a God who dies on a cross? Is it a nation state that's telling you to kill all the Jews? What is that vertical point of contact that makes you have a connection with people you've never met before? Is it something that's enabling you to be better at self-defense or worse at self-defense? Is it something that makes you more open to the other as an individual, or more like a cartoon character where they're just another Republican and you're a Republican as well? So we have to, like, one of the reasons why Christianity is interesting, because the vertical connection demands a horizontal connection of the particularity of that person. Like, you have to be open to them in their individuality and lay down your life for them, just like Jesus did, right? And also be willing to work through their difficulties, because Jesus died on the cross, right? So that's where I don't know if socially we've really thought of the social technologies that are vertical relations to be aware that it really, really matters the character and details of that vertical relation, because that colors the possibilities of your horizontal relations, upon which the possibilities of a meaningful pluralism rests. And so it's really, and we really have not thought that enough, in my opinion. I'll also note, as a final point, I think it's good to have a certain discomfort with the word satanic. It's important to note that Satan is not actually a name. It's more of a title that means deceiver. God doesn't name Satan Satan, because a name implies essence. You know, when Adam names the animals, that means they have substance, they have essence, right? What's very interesting is that Satan is not a name. It's a description of a force of deception. It doesn't even get the dignity of a name, because that would be giving it too much of an essence. So the problem is the word satanic can imply that evil has essence, when really everything is good in its substance, but in its accidents, to use that Aristotelian distinction, things can be evil because they can be a disordered good. But it's very, very important to avoid language that could reify a evil as isness, because then you lose sight of the possibility of redemption, the possibility of resurrection and new life. And ultimately, we should note that all spiritual warfare and all philosophy of self-defense is ultimately in service of resurrection, of new life, of new creation. That's why you're doing it, because you want to preserve or make possible the space of where new creation is possible, where redemption is possible, where things can come out in their fullest, most negentropic form versus entropic form. But that requires, but using a language that suggests that evil has substance can work against that, because you're actually setting limits on the possibility of new creation where that substantive evil is encountered. Because if it is evil in terms of substance, well, that means new creation can't reach there, because the thing is evil, right? So it is very important to have a language that never makes evil have substance, because in doing that, you may unintentionally set limits on new creation and new life and resurrection. So I think it's good to have that sort of hesitancy against that language.
Yeah, that was really, really helpful. And I can certainly see in the contemporary Twitter sphere where I think people are kind of coming back into relationship with the notion of evil or of Satan. They are giving it essence and they're giving it more form. And so they're looking at certain things in Hollywood or wherever it is, or amongst governing elites, and they're saying, there it is, that's where Satan is. But there's a way that you kind of reify the evil and you give it more substance. And it seems to me like my sense of how the exorcist, or how the Christian relates to evil, if you look at like the classic traits of the exorcist, he doesn't mostly go Like, he doesn't go and attack and reify the evil. He doesn't say, "Look, you are terrible. You are da 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 da." He kind of, it's like a offensive self defense in which the priest starts to call upon the name of Christ, call upon the name of Christ, or indeed call upon God, or he starts to use Scripture, or he's using these different tools, um, icons, crosses, water, all of which are symbolic, can be sacralized symbols of beautiful truths. And so it seems like the way that you kind of come into encounter or conflict with this energy is not ultimately by attacking it, but there is this kind of masculine girding. And I want to read the passage now from Ephesians. This is Ephesians 6:10. It's like the go-to passage on spiritual warfare that I've been pointed to by Christians. Thus begins. It's about the armor of God. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you have done everything to stand, stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. So I invite people to receive that not as a sermon on high, but as a form of poetry at the very least, about what it means to take on spiritual warfare. And this, to me, there's two things in here I want to point to, and then hand it back to you, Daniel. First, there's a sublimation of warfare into spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare isn't warfare, but it's sublimating the language, the power, the energy of the armor, of the breastplate, of the shield, of the sword into the spiritual domain. And ultimately, there's a line in here, that you may be able to stand your ground. That feels really in the spirit of what we've spoken about, philosophical self-defense, that you have the capacity to hold your own in the face of assault, in the face of deception. It's not firing arrows back, it's extinguishing the arrows. There's a kind of like dissolving of the attack that's sent before you. And then the sword, which is obviously the most obviously violent, it's that which cuts, is the sword of spirit, which is the word, which is logos. It's a form of true participation in reality, is what cuts through, and what's being cut through is then deception, that which is not true. So I know we're getting closer to the close here, but I wanted to bring that in as a piece of art for us to contemplate, and anything else that comes up for you.
Oh, magnificent. I think bringing attention to things like stand ground is very interesting. Also, the sword of spirit and word logos, where the word in the beginning, Jesus was the word, and what did the word do to defeat evil? Die. go to hell and rise again. So, there's these kind of ironies, like, so there's this notion that your sword is this resurrection. You kill me, I'll just come back to life. So kill me if you want. That's like the ultimate sword, right? Like, if your resurrection is kind of the ultimate weapon, you never lose under that one. It's also interesting, the belt of truth. So what holds all of the armor together is truth. It is interesting as well that you have the helmet of salvation. So the mind, like, salvation is the ability to protect the head. So there's something about the mind and salvation that are connected together as well. And so, no, it's very interesting, because Paul, when he's describing that in Ephesians, also has to keep in mind what Jesus did. And was Jesus dressed like a soldier like this? And so, because the whole expectation with Jesus is that he was going to come in as a Roman overlord and overthrow Rome. Well, he didn't do that. And so what is Paul doing here? Well, he's showing how actually Jesus kind of was an Apollo figure in his own way, because he stood his ground with a kind of armor that was far greater than the armor of, say, a Napoleon war god, because what that spiritual armor is truly invincible, and it's truly found in the full human being. It is found, like, the full human being is able to keep their mind secure. They are able to hold themselves together with truth. They are able to defend themselves ultimately with a sword that does not fear death, and they're able to pierce deception with logos and different things like that. Are you really that powerful if you have to kill everyone that says a lie to you because you're unable to tell the difference between lie and truth? I mean, that's a question that kind of comes up. If the only way to keep yourself from being deceived is to kill everyone, to actually kill everyone who would deceive you, you're actually quite weak, right? Like, you're not able to face the deception and overcome it. And so what you see in Jesus is Jesus actually faces death. He actually suffers temptation. He suffers all of these things as opposed to avoid it. And you see overlaid in the description of the spiritual armor that is not protection from. That's kind of the tricky thing. Most of the time, armor is protection from, but in this armor, you see participation in Jesus, who is the humbling servant who died on the cross. So it's interesting to think you have a description of armor that is not protection from evil, but a kind of participation in the conditions where evil arises, but will not defeat you, because death has no sting. In the way that kind of Paul brings those things together to suggest that, no, Jesus was that Roman god coming in. He was actually just greater than that, because there's a way you can do armor that isn't protection from, but actually a deeper facing. And it makes me think of Owen's work on Thymos, where there's really a sense in which when Achilles goes on the battlefield and he's not wearing armor so much, it's almost like more manly than to go out wearing armor, right? Because you're protected from. And so there's something about nakedness that actually is more like masculine or kind of warrior or thymotic in a way than wearing armor. And so it's interesting in that description of the armor, there's simultaneously a nod toward the vulnerability that is seen in the person of Jesus through those various symbolisms. And I think that also suggests why we have to think in terms of self-defense versus protection from and avoidance. Because we could just say, well, most of the history of unfortunately, a lot of the history of philosophy has been avoidance. Let's go to our clouds in the sky. Let's go to our college where we don't have to deal with blue-collar work. There's been a whole lot of thinking that's been escapism and avoidance, right? Well, that's not what we need to, that's not what philosophy is supposed to be. Philosophy is supposed to be self-defense, which is where you are equipped with the ability to handle what the world throws at you, as opposed to avoiding what the world throws at you, which in a weird way is a kind of armor, but it's not armor that is this escapist protection from, that I think you can see Paul is trying to navigate in the symbolism. And I think that's what we need to think and be called to engage in. I would also sort of note that this reifying, like we're saying, this kind of reifying of evil unintentionally and giving it substance, it makes me think of, because there's been this emphasis on relation, we also have to be careful. Philosophy as self-defense also helps us not reify the wrong things. In the same way that to engage well in theology is not to reify the wrong things intentionally, right? That's another form of self-defense, to make sure you are not reifying the wrong things. Because if you reify the wrong things, you're making yourself relate to the world in a manner that is unreal and false. So that is actually going to be quite detrimental to you, right? Well, it makes me, in the same thing, we don't want to give evil substance unintentionally. Someone like Owen Barfield, who was friends with C.S. Lewis, Austin Farrer, and all those people, said we have to be careful to reify things over relations in his wonderful book, Saving the Appearances. He said that things are idolatry. That bookcase there is just a collection of relations. If you treat it like a bookcase, you're saying it. Funny enough, he said if we're not careful, we treat things as the ground of their own being, as opposed to only having being to the degree they participate in God. So someone like Owen Barfield, when he talks about the rainbow, is warning that we need philosophy and thinking to realize that the truest things in the world are relational, that relations are ontological, and that things, if we give them substance, are actually idolatry. And you could really see that permeating all of the modern world today is a kind of idolatry of thingness, as opposed to the only things that have substance are relational. And this is why only good has substance, because good is relational. The good is the Trinity. The good is when there is a relation present, a real deep relation, not just a proximity. And that is reality. And philosophy as self-defense helps you avoid the temptation of thinking things exist other than participatory relationships. So then the question becomes, how do I get good at those relationships? How do I get open to those relationships? How do I let myself be gathered in terms of those relationships? But again, your brain would never make you think that you're doing something problematic by calling that a bookcase. Why would you ever think that? That sounds absurd. That sounds crazy. It sounds crazy to be nitpicky about using the word Satan as a name. Come on, guys. What's the big deal? It sounds absurd to be concerned about the scientists. It sounds absurd to be worried about the colleges manipulating you. Everything that you ought to do on the face of it sounds absurd. That's one of the reasons why you need philosophy, to work through that feeling of absurdity, to see the wisdom in it, because many things that are wise, as the Bible says, are foolishness to man. The things that are wise for God are foolishness to man. If you don't have philosophy, and let's say you only have education, you're not going to be able to tell what things you experience as foolish actually has a wisdom on the other side of it. You won't work yourself through that foolishness to the wisdom. And then, of course, if you never experience that wisdom, you never experience that thing you never experienced, so you don't know you have it, and hell is locked from the inside, as C.S. Lewis put it. You're locked off from that thing you never knew you encountered, and because you don't know you didn't encounter it, you don't experience the loss. And the tragedy is that you don't experience a loss. The tragedy is that you feel like that you have everything you ever need in life, because if you're missing out on the fullness of life, you don't experience the lack of the fullness of life to know that you're lacking in. And one of the hopes of philosophy as self-defense is to keep yourself from falling into that mistake, to keep yourself from locking yourself inside of hell where the door is locked from the inside, to keep yourself from cutting yourself off from the wisdom on the other side of foolishness because you experienced the foolishness when you first encountered it. So stop there. Philosophy as self-defense would keep you from stopping yourself there, as opposed to working through to the other side.
Yeah, very, very well put. I think that the key, the being able to make your own lock and your own key to open the door out of the hell of your own creation is perhaps the most compelling um, reason why we should all be interested in philosophy as a form of self-defense and escapism. And in the best version of escapism, escaping our own traps. Um, so yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. This has been a really, really a tour de force, and I really like that we were able to organize this conversation in two parts as well. I think I might well release it in two parts. Um, and I hope that it will be beneficial to people. I'm thinking it might be worthwhile to write a kind of Ephesians for the liminal web, and what the call to spiritual warfare is in the language of today, and what it means to be girded by the fellowship of the wisdom commons, and how dialogos fits in, and how all of these things fit in. And so I'm very excited about that possibility. And thank you. I feel really, really renewed, and I see myself seeing quite differently in relation to these questions of spiritual warfare and philosophy of self-defense. So, hallelujah. Thank you very much. And great to have you on Sense Space again.
Always a pleasure, Jacob. Thank you so much. Like I said, I always enjoy speaking with you.
Thank you.